I wanted to explore a film that looked not just at the labor side of things as food chains did, but at the kind of original people that gave their bodies and their land to the system that we are all now living
Flipping the table.
Food sovereignty is a phrase that too few Americans are aware of or use. I hope today's conversation with my guest, film director Sanjay Rawal, will provide you with a deeper understanding of this critically important concept. We'll discuss his new film, Gather, which tells 3 stories that illuminate the efforts of Native Americans who are reasserting sovereignty over their food sources and choices in inspiring ways that lead to better health for Native people. As many of you may know, there is no group in North America that has been more harmed by the modern American diet than Native people. Our highly processed, sugar-laden food is literally killing huge numbers from diabetes and related ailments. Diabetes, obesity, heart disease, often all related to nutrition, are comorbidities that make people especially vulnerable to COVID-19. Reservations across the nation are battling the pandemic and experiencing terrible losses of life. This is not a new tragedy for the continent's first people. As the film makes clear, the purposeful genocide perpetrated by the U.S. government as it colonized native lands was most effectively done by the destruction of native foodways. Sanjay's subjects reveal the story of how this loss of culture and health is starting to be reversed by some visionary warriors in pursuit of food sovereignty. So, before embarking on his career as a filmmaker, Sanjay spent 15 years working on human rights campaigns globally. Then, his first feature film, Food Chains, was produced by Eva Longoria and Eric Schlosser with narration by Forrest Whitaker. It chronicled the rise of a group of tomato pickers in Florida who were displaced Oaxacans, Chiapan, and Guatemalan indigenous, and who successfully fought for better working conditions and wages. The film won numerous awards, was released theatrically in 40 cities by Screen Media, and was acquired eventually by Netflix. Roots of Change actually hosted one of these screenings in partnership with Sanjay and his team back in 2014 in Sacramento. Sanjay's work has been supported by an impressive list of foundations and won an assortment of honors, including a James Beard Media Award. Welcome, Sanjay.
Michael, thank you very much for having me. How are you?
I'm well, despite the fact that we're again in these terrible firestorms up here in Northern California. So I'm gonna pretend that's not happening as we have a really good conversation about your work, and really excited to talk to you again. And so, before we actually dive into your film, let's hear a bit about your journey prior to filmmaking, and then why you eventually turned to film as your medium.
Great question. In a nutshell, I grew up in the Bay Area, but I was a child of an agriculturalist, a tomato farmer, and tomato scientist. And unbeknownst to me, I kind of grew up in the heart of California agriculture. My dad, Dr. Sanjay Rawal, worked for Del Monte and RJR, and then went on to work for Calgene, and then became a seed producer and geneticist. Most of his tomatoes were sold via the Del Cabo brand at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's.
Wow.
But that said, when I was 22, after graduating from Cal, I wanted to get as far away from California as I possibly could without going to Boston, and ended up in New York City. I actually came to New York City to follow an Indian spiritual teacher, Sri Chinmoy, and that kind of opened up my eyes to the world. He quickly put me in touch with friends of his like Desmond Tutu and others, as I had an interest in humanitarian aid and service. And that took me around the world. And I spent about 15 years working in human rights and working in international development until my dad sent me a book by Barry Estabrook, which many of your listeners will have read Tomatoland.
Yep.
At that time, I was working on a lot of agricultural rights issues for laborers in Cameroon and West Africa. Having grown up in the California tomato industry, I was completely blown away or shocked, frightened, embarrassed that the same issues I was focusing on internationally were occurring in the U.S. I made a bunch of short films just as a hobby and as a way to just have a little bit of fun, and those didn't do poorly. But I had enough confidence to launch into a film on the Florida tomato industry, focusing on the coalition of immokalee workers. The film was called Food Chains and came out in 2014.
Yeah,
and I haven't looked back ever since.
Yeah, and actually that was a really great film as well. And Roots of Change, actually, we did an event with your crew in Sacramento and brought legislators and a lot of activists, and we did a big screening in one of the big theaters in Sacramento, and it was one of the best events I remember us doing in Sacramento ever. It was great.
Well, it was definitely a highlight of our whole campaign, particularly having you there and framing that particular issue not as something that was of the 50s, 60s, or 70s, and really helping audiences understand that times are different from those halcyon days where labor was strong and labor rights were protected and respected.
Yeah, things have changed, and now, God, with COVID and all the workers being harmed by COVID, it's a whole nother lens by which to view this challenge of bringing, healthy working conditions for the people that feed us every day. It's an amazing journey that the workers have been on, and hopefully we'll make some more progress given the tragic situation. But let's move on to Gather. That was, first of all, let me just say that that's a very interesting journey you've been on, from California and a father in agriculture to around the world journeys working with indigenous people and worker rights, and then ending back here. It's kind of like the hero's journey in that sense. It's wonderful.
A hero's journey with the absence of a hero.
Well, we all have our little journey to learn. So yes. Let's talk about Gather. So why did you, first of all, I love the name. It's important to talk about why you titled it that, but why that film? Why the film Gather?
Great question. In Food Chains, the farm worker film, we focused on Florida, but we had a few vignettes from California. You couldn't do a film on labor rights and farm work without talking about the history of labor rights in California. Mm-hmm. And we had a little mention just of the early Spanish missions and the introduction of, larger scale farming into California and the enslavement of California natives in order to make that a reality. And that was it. It was just a 1 or 2 minute mention, but I felt that topic needed to be done justice. When we look at the beginnings of the United States, or even further prior, the beginnings of the colonial empires in the New World, those are based on extractive capitalism, land-based capitalism. And originally, the labor for that agricultural activity was, provided or depended on the enslavement of the indigenous people. After thousands, hundreds of thousands of those early enslaved natives died, mm-hmm. the slave trade began. Mm-hmm. And we haven't really pushed away from that legacy. So I wanted to explore a film that looked not just at the labor side of things as Food Chains did, but at the kind of original people that gave their bodies and their land to the system that we are all now living in. Yes. And that's how the idea of Gather came about.
And how far back? Because it seems so prescient now that we're in this moment of Black Lives Matter and the unjust killings of Black and brown people, particularly men. So, what's your, when did you start thinking about this? And when did you kind of gather the steam? Because, be interesting.
So, the documentary film industry started with an exploitative ethnographic staged film on an Inuit man.
Yes.
And the filmmaker Robert Flaherty made that movie, Nanook of the North. Mm-hmm. And since then, Native Americans and indigenous people around the world have had outsiders tell their own stories.
Hmm.
So obviously, representation is important across the board, but with film, it's categorically more important when it comes to Native stories and Native issues. So I didn't dare project or propose myself as a filmmaker for this movie, but there's a great organization working on food sovereignty issues out of Longmont, California, called First Nations Development Institute.
Hmm.
And, we began having conversations. And at the end of it all, we kind of came to the decision to start this movie together, where I would work as the filmmaker, but they would be the producers and, work on making the film, the stories that we were putting into the film be told from a completely Native perspective.
Yeah, and that's I
And
remember Michael Roberts. He's the CEO president of that organization in
that's
Colorado.
correct.
Yeah, he's a really good man. I met him when we were both working very closely with Kellogg Foundation back in the day. Yeah,
Very cool. So we
yeah.
started that. We started those discussions in 2016. Began filming in 2017,
Hmm.
and literally finished the film and all of the post production work a week before businesses were closed in New York City in March.
Wow, wow, what timing! Well, it is a timely film, and quite compelling. And I love the fact that you um, have felt the need and the connection to the story of indigenous people around their foods, and that's really what the story is. Why don't you give people obviously without spoiling it, but describe how you knit together these three very interesting stories.
Well, we really wanted to make effectively a Food Inc. style movie about a pretty esoteric or non-mainstream topic, food sovereignty, and obviously we'll get to what that means, in your world, um, in a bit. But the film follows a White Mountain Apache tribal member named Nephi Craig, a chef who was one of the kind of top up and coming chefs, but kind of fell prey to the Anthony Bourdain-esque lifestyle of hedonism in chefing, and ended up having to go back to his reservation in eastern Arizona, to sober up.
Hmm.
And along that new journey of recovery, he realized that his connection to food was much deeper than just culinary school and working in five-star, five-diamond restaurants. It was something critical to the spirituality of his people. And at the same time, post colonization, post contact, the Apache have been some of the most ruthlessly subjugated indigenous on Turtle Island. And the health disparities and the effects of that subjugation have been extreme. Really high rates of diabetes, really high rates of infant mortality, all the way, all along that spectrum.
Hmm.
And he wanted to start a restaurant, a high-end, completely affordable restaurant that focused on Apache cuisine, Apache preparations, but in a modern way to suit modern palates. So we follow him trying to start this restaurant, and we interweave two other main stories: a group of boys on the Klamath River in Northern California struggling to maintain a salmon lifestyle, directly in the shadow of a gigantic dam, and facing the uncontrollable consequences of overfishing and climate change on their salmon population.
Hmm.
And lastly, a young woman, a high school student when we filmed her, Elsie Dubray, who grew up on a buffalo ranch in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, and is dedicating herself to exploring the science of Native cuisine and the importance of buffalo as a nutritional component to early plains diets, and trying to influence and radically change USDA policy towards traditional Native foods to allow those foods to be, grown widely and disseminated on reservations.
Yeah, so congratulations on how you did that. I found it quite compelling, and there are a couple of things I really noticed. One was the focus on young people. The young men who are fighting to maintain the salmon fisheries and their way of life around salmon. The young woman in the Dakotas who's you were just speaking of, who's dedicating her life to the health and native diets. And then obviously the crew that's working with Nephi about there were a lot of young people kind of surrounding him. You could see it in the film, who were working with him to create that restaurant and those foodways. And it reminded me, as I watched it, I think you remember, I was very associated with the slow food movement in its early years, and we used to work with the Tohono O'odham tribe out of Arizona, and they had a real tepary bean tradition. And I remember meeting the two guys that started that. I don't know if you've ever met them, Terrell Drew Johnson and Tristan Reeder. Did you ever come in contact with those guys out of Arizona?
I know them, but I haven't had the privilege of meeting them.
Yeah, they did. So they, in many ways, described. I mean, they were experiencing obesity, disease, and they took on this native foodways thing, and then they started running as well. And I know you did a film about indigenous folks running, I believe, and that was inspiring because that was many years ago, maybe 20. And then I didn't hear a lot about it until the last couple of years. I could see, wow, it was like a little teeny fire, metaphor for right now in my neighborhood. And then it's kind of really starting to take off. And you captured 3 of those big stories, it seems to me.
Well, look, thank you. As people know, there's really no such thing as a Native American. There are 500 and some odd tribal nations, and hundreds of more that existed pre-contact. In fact, California was considered the most linguistically diverse place on the planet, with numerous language systems. But again, it's like that was all based on people's relationship with the environment. Mm-hmm. When food sources were so abundant and near villages, people didn't need to travel much. They didn't need to live a nomadic lifestyle, and they evolved highly specific cultures to very local places. And as we kind of push into the definition or the expansion of the idea of what is the American food system, what is the American food story, and as movements in the South and movements in other parts of the country have helped to kind of promote their relevance on a national stage, it seems like we're moving more and more closer to that original Native American idea of food systems and food sovereignty, but maybe without paying the direct heed that we need to really get the story synchronized with what food systems were like on this continent for thousands of years.
Yeah, it reminds me of the linkage, and I do credit again Slow Food with this way back, connecting biodiversity and cultural diversity, because it was these indigenous people all around the world that were basically stewarding their food systems in order to survive in whatever region they were in. And so it is hopeful to me that we have this kind of returning lens of indigenous to our food sources in the places that we live. It does give me some hope, given the circumstances we're running into now.
I mean, there was it should be noted that there was a tremendous upheaval in global supply chains and global trade about 550, 600 years ago, when the European colonizers began first coming to the Western Hemisphere and then pushing to India and Indonesia and to the Far East. And along that effort to really extract wealth from other economies came a much more rapid, much more revolutionary transmission of food. Mm-hmm. Before the Spanish and Columbus came to the Caribbean, and subsequently, there were no hot peppers anywhere in the world. There were no potatoes. There were no squashes. Africa didn't have cassava. A number of legumes came from the New World: chocolate, corn, avocados, pineapples. So much of current global cuisine was radically transformed in the last few hundred years. Mm-hmm. Before that, yes, there were trading routes like the Great Silk Road, but the majority of human population were deeply rooted to place. Mm. If not for hundreds and hundreds of years because of war, definitely for generations. Mm-hmm. And if we think about our primary relationship with the environment, there's air is the same everywhere, obviously, with differences in pollution levels. Water is the same everywhere. The difference, and we don't photosynthesize, I guess, apart from vitamin D production. We get our energy from the environment. Our relationship with the environment is most critical around food. Like if you were born as an Inuit and you couldn't process fat, you died.
Right.
And so we genetically evolved an incredibly close relationship with our immediate environment through our ability to harness energy, calories from that immediate environment. And now that nearly all of us have been displaced from the places that really governed our deepest genetics, we don't know how to stay healthy.
Right.
I mean, even in the U.S., the farmer's market diet is the same mescaline, the same cherry tomatoes, the same pick of what food culture kind of asks us to eat. And obviously, the supermarket diet and the fast food diet is even more standardized and even more deleterious for our health.
Deadly, even.
So, deadly.
Deadly.
And so the questions are what is our relationship with our environment vis-a-vis food systems, and how can we ensure our own genetic health and our ability to pass on our genes to subsequent generations by eating healthy? I mean, lastly, right now, if you grow up in a big city and you don't have a genetic predisposition to literally survive a high sugar, high fat, high salt diet, then you're not going to pass on your genes. And think about how much genetic variation across tens of thousands of years that we hold is going to be lost just because young kids with diabetes die early, don't procreate, don't pass on the wonderful variation that they hold deep within their cells because of just the inability to process terrible poison.
Yeah, it's a kind of extinction story, isn't it? Because of a maladaptation of human behavior to the natural world. I totally agree with you. I mean, I'll just my own personal. I mean, I always carried a lot of extra weight in my life, and it was. What I really learned, it was all that it was. I loved pasta, right, and I loved white rice, and I loved things that were harming me and kept the weight on it. I actually moved to basically a keto diet. I'm eating very few carbs. I'm eating lots of protein, lots of fat, actually healthy fat from grass-fed animals, and green vegetables. And I've lost almost 30 pounds in about a year. And it just came off. And as I watched the film, I thought about all those Native Americans, first Americans who were forced, and you really bring this story up in the film, the basically the attack of the U.S. government and all those Europeans who were moving west, the attack on the food systems, which basically brought down these civilizations that were in North America prior to Europeans.
Yeah, and the subsequent action was that natives were removed from their land and pushed as far away from potential farming land as possible, because that farmland was reserved for westward pushing settlers. I mean, the irony is that Native Americans who were pushed on terribly rocky land, ended up, having resources like petroleum and
gas,
gas, other things that weren't important pre-industrial revolution, but then fueled the next 100 years of expansion.
Yep.
That said, since the railway lines, were key, and natives were pushed as far away from those railway lines as possible, and highways were built mirroring those railway lines. Indian country is basically as far away from the American food supply chain physically as possible. Mm-hmm. And couple that with lack of economic opportunity, they get really cruddy food at really, really high prices.
Right.
And they're forced to skip ahead of us in terms of progress. Like, they don't have Whole Foods. They don't really have farmers markets. They don't have this moderately healthy, ubiquitous American kind of elite diet. They have to go back to things that the land around them can provide. And not all of them are on farmable land again. So they've got to go back to earlier food traditions of hunting, of fishing, of foraging, and developing a deeply seasonal relationship with that environment amidst literally a holocaust of fast food and cheap calories. And so the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the need to go back to those food systems because, COVID is ripping through Indian country for similar systemic reasons that they don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to the same resources, herbs, vitamins, supplements, health food stores, alternatives that we do just because we've got physical access to Whole Foods and other pharmaceutical, healthy options, et cetera. So that the push for food sovereignty has become even more urgent now.
Yes. It reminds me of last summer, a very interesting moment. There was a slow food event in Denver, and we had a chance to interview a Dene woman who is been fighting on her reservation to tax sugar, junk foods, basically. And it was the first place in the United States where junk food was taxed. They actually passed the bill, and they're raising money to support food systems that are native. And I think that's a really important story for a lot of people to realize, because it gets to this idea of food sovereignty. So why don't we jump into that? Why don't you talk about, because the term is used right at the beginning by I think it's Nephi. I think he brings it. One of the folks you're talking to in the film, or is talking in the film about their work, uses the term early on in front of an audience of Native peoples, food sovereignty.
Technically, food sovereignty is the right to choose foods that are culturally specific to your people. Mm-hmm. Obviously, food security is the step before, where you have access to calories. There's a middle step where maybe you have access to better, higher quality calories, like a Whole Foods. But the meaning of food sovereignty is pretty interesting. And the way I began to really understand what it meant to me was doing something that one of our characters, Twyla Casador, did on her reservation in San Carlos Apache. Mm-hmm. From the 1500s, when the Spanish began pushing up from the Caribbean and Mexico into modern-day Arizona, they began destroying the traditional Apache food system. Mm-hmm. And Twyla and her cohorts were trying to discover what recipes, sustained her people, her ancestors, what existed out in the wild that provided that ingredient base. And so she went in the early 2000s to elders, then 80 and 90 years old, born in the 1910s, 1920s, and asked them if they could remember what was in their great-grandparents' pantries. People who were then living on a reservation, but who grew up, before the existence of reservations. Mm-hmm. I subsequently went to my mom and dad, both in their 80s, late 70s, and asked them if they could remember what were in the pantries of mm-hmm. their East Indian grandparents and great-grandparents in India, mm-hmm. North and South. Mm. And that provided me a context that I didn't realize. It was a series of foodstuffs that couldn't be further away from what Indian restaurant food is and what Indian food cooked with Whole Foods and Berkeley Bowl ingredients are. Uh-huh. The variety of rices, the variety of millets, the high fiber, the low glycemic index of their respective ancestral cuisines was striking, and obviously formed my genetic strength, and I'm eating very little of those raw ingredients in my day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. But again, it's like those foods have a story, and those stories had to, really arrange the life of those villages. Like, people learned songs around the millet harvest. People learned songs and religious prayers that they sang around pounding rice and fermenting it into what we now know as dosas and idlis and fermented South Indian foods. Mm-hmm. So there's a real cultural relationship as well with that food. So those of us who are non-native, might need to go back a few hundred years because we might not be living on the land that our ancestors lived on. But we all have that story, and that story didn't just form the genetic basis of who we are, but they really formed the psyche of our ancestors, and helped to form inadvertently the personalities that we have today.
Yes,
But
yes.
for Native Americans, it's like they need food sovereignty to literally survive. They've got to re-emphasize the importance of the foods by reestablishing the cultural and social conditions that made them very, very healthy nations.
This is Michael. I just wanted to say how thrilled I am and excited that you're listening to Flipping the Table. These are the kinds of conversations I've wanted to share with people for a decade or more. So please like us, share with your friends, write a review, and subscribe.
One of the really, I'll just say, cute, endearing, and entertaining portions of the film was when Twyla is teaching them how to catch the pack rats, which their ancestors did, and that was really quite with her young, I guess maybe a relative young woman, child, with her doing that.
I mean, it shows how easily habits can change. You referenced a particular rodent that lives in the desert in Arizona, incredibly clean. It eats grains, it eats medicinal herbs that are indigestible for humans that have lectins that are poisonous to us, but when they exist in compounds in the rat flesh or in the pack rat flesh, they provide some level of immunity. And so Apache would traditionally hunt these mice, these rats, super fast moving in the winter months. But when the Spanish came in the 1500s, just coming out of like big cities where the plague was about to hit, and saw these Apache literally catching what they knew was rats, they severely stigmatized that. And so it's just a corollary of like how now, kids are taught that Red Bull is cool. It makes you feel a certain way. It gives you a certain identity. Drinking Gatorade, eating chips gives you a certain identity. And like going out into the woods for days and hunting for a deer, or going and spending hours harvesting wild onions is not cool.
Right.
And so these outside influences have had a detrimental effect on food sovereignty in Indian country.
Yeah,
changed people's palates.
Yeah, and so that's a decolonization process is really underway. That's what the film is capturing in my mind, a decolonization process and a return to health, because in many of the scenes where the protagonists of the film are engaging their fellow native tribal members, they are talking about this return to health, their own journeys, this return to health. I thought that was quite compelling, and you could see in the audiences that were listening to them, the emotion that was released in many of them, hearing these stories and seeing the return to health of those who were speaking.
I mean, when we look at this idea of colonization, no matter the color of our skin or the parts of the world that we might have come from, if we're not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, we've all been colonized by the Industrial Revolution.
And capitalism, right.
And capitalism. It's like every single religious tradition has a few holidays that are focused on specific foods. Those foods have had relevance to our respective people for, thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And in fact, much of the spiritual life was, centered around particular foods and particular harvests and particular offerings, etc. But we have allowed ourselves to lose that spiritual connection to food by becoming addicted, in a sense, to like Whole Foods diet, to McDonald's diet, to different corollaries of what the industrialized food system has told us, we need to eat. And different organizations have marketed to us as, providing a certain identity that we want to claim as our own.
Yeah, that's, you remind me of In 1979, 80, I lived in a village in Nepal in the foothills of the Himalaya, and the millet was grown in the hills around us, and rice was grown in the valleys along the Indrawati River where I was living. And I remember when we harvested both millet and when we harvested rice, there were different, there were like little gatherings of the different peoples, and there were different tribes in the hills versus the valleys, and they would come together at the millet harvest and then at the rice harvest, and they would celebrate, and they would make chung, which was a kind of beer from the millet, and there were different kinds of prayers. So it was a beautiful kind of. It was one of the. It was one of the. Those were the only times where all the people gathered, and I have wonderful pictures of the beautiful clothes people wore and the things that they were doing. It was a really special time, those harvests.
I mean, yeah, I get, that's a lovely image. And granted, there could be severe health, problems in remote areas when there's disease, when there's accidents. Modern life does afford us, a level of comfort that is, frankly, we all enjoy to some degree. But there have been dozens of studies that have showed that those agrarian and or hunter-gatherer lifestyles leave us so much more time to pursue culture and spirituality than we call it the 9 to 5, 40-hour work week. But for most of us, it's 55, 65, 75
Right.
hours a week.
Right.
And for what?
Right. Exactly. Well, I mean, this year, 2020, I'm going to remember it as the year that the underlying challenges of capitalism and the impact in so many ways on our life, and the need for our concept of capitalism to be completely reframed and renewed, or some other system's going to have to be developed if we're going to survive this century, because it's incredible the number of impacts emanating from it in every way, from climate change to nutritional health to overwork and all of the associated mental health problems. It's incredible to me. So, I mean, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, even the ideological differences that kind of plague, modern life, people were forced to put those differences behind them to participate in the hunt, to participate in gathering water, to participate in the harvest, the planting. People helped each other out because they understood that, without that caloric strength, the communities had no strength and no resilience and no hope for survival. So even that common action of food gathering built strong, healthy societies. And in the absence of that, it's very, very difficult for us to find any shared common ground from a lifestyle perspective.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that, because as you spoke it, I thought about the need for social cohesion in our country right now. We have very little social cohesion, and resilience of a community is very dependent on the ability of the level of cohesion within a community. And sadly, the way that we're experiencing, and now I'm experiencing here in Sonoma County, where we have lots of rural people and lots of urban people, and so you get this clash of worlds, is we have to have tragedies like fires or storms or floods. That's where we get our cohesion, and often in cultures it's war that brings the cohesion, and those are really negative ways. We had so many more positive ways: the hunt, the harvest, the building of a barn even, were ways that social cohesion was built, and we do need to get back to that. And actually, one of the great things about the food movement, the good food movement in the United States, is that all these young people are gathering to farm and build communities, food communities, and that does build cohesion.
You're right. You mentioned that my last movie was on running. It was called 3100 Run and Become. And we released it in 2018 around the midterm election then. And I was constantly reminding myself that there are very few activities, really, in my mind, just a couple, that almost anybody could go anywhere around the world, participate in with people who they'd never met, could never share a word of the same language, and would leave with lifelong friends. And that movie was based on running, where you could go and find a running group, in almost every city, go for a run, laugh and yell and experience joy together and never speak a word. And the corollary is food. You could go to a restaurant, not speak a word of the language the waiter and the chef speak, have a grand old time, experiment like crazy, and have an experience that you and those around you will remember for the rest of their life.
That's
And
right.
I couldn't think of, communal activities like those that we can still practice without having some elite level of skill like hunting or something else,
Mhm.
or even farming, an elite level of farming skill.
Right.
So the question is like, how can we return to these activities and make them important, even if we do them in a diluted format?
Correct. Yep. And well, sadly, we have almost 10 minutes left. So I'd like to just turn the conversation a little bit to some other things. Like, I was really impressed by your list of executive producers. I mean, you've got Jason Momoa, the actor, Brian Mendoza, a very talented, known producer of stuff in Hollywood. Wendy Schmidt from the Schmidt Family Foundation, 11th Hour Project. Christine Shantz, a good friend of mine from from the Slow Food Movement. I mean, how did you assemble all these people?
Well, to give credit where credit's due, the idea was really a brainstorm of Jennifer Buffett of the Noble Foundation.
Wow.
And she and Peter Buffett are amongst the biggest institutional givers to Indian country. I mean, as you know, just I think 0.3% of all American philanthropic money goes to Native-led organizations working in Indian country.
Mm-hmm.
And with the exception of a couple of very modern fortunes like Bill Gates and Eric and Wendy Schmidt, based on tech, the majority of American philanthropy was based on land and extracting wealth from the land and extracting wealth from land that was stolen.
Yep.
And the fact that less than 0.5% goes back to the communities whose land provided that wealth is shocking. But Jennifer funds a lot of Indian country work, primarily through the First Nations Development Institute.
Oh, great.
And so she deserves credit for launching the project. But Wendy Schmidt was pivotal in helping us to, maintain our production, during some ups and downs. And Christine came on, and at the very, very end, even though I've been in touch with Jason and Brian the whole time, I hadn't pitched them on helping to promote and finish the production of the movie until I was able to show them a cut of the film. Jason, as a native Hawaiian, is deeply involved with land rights issues, and he has made the connection between land rights and food rights and land rights his whole adult life.
Mm.
He was critical in helping us really finish the film, and provided some great notes, as of course Brian did as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we got lucky, but I think that the characters in the film really provided those who we asked help from, a compelling reason and case to really be a part of this project.
Yeah, and I think with that nice lineup, you're going to get a lot of hopefully social media support as you get the film out, right? So what is the hope for the film? What would you like to see happen as you release?
Well, that's a great question. It's twofold. The film was created primarily as a tool for organizations working in Indian country to raise awareness of these issues, to inspire people that they're involving in their programs, to launch new programs. Jennifer Buffett and Peter Buffett and the Noble Foundation quite generously created a grant program just around this movie where First Nations has the ability to offer dozens of pretty large grants to food sovereignty producers, food sovereignty activists in Indian country. So number one, we want the movie to be screened far and wide. Unfortunately, without in-person screenings being a possibility, and with the severe bandwidth issues that Indian country has in general,
Mm-hmm.
we've kind of been forced to go old school and print tens of thousands of DVDs for dissemination free of charge in Indian country.
Mm-hmm.
But outside Indian country, both with urban native populations, and as you know, a lot of Indian land is now enveloped by cities in California in
Mm-hmm.
particular,
Mm-hmm.
with California natives and with food justice and food sovereignty activists. We want this movie to kind of start the sister conversations of Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
Again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, the need for bodies was because the land had already been taken.
Mm-hmm.
And, although the issues on the legacy of slavery are different than the legacy of the native or indigenous genocide, they're the obverse and reverse of the same coin.
Yeah.
And the movements have always intersected. The movements have found a lot of shared strength with one another. And now a lot of the movements are similar. I mean, natives experience civil rights trauma to the degree or even greater degree than African Americans do, from police, from institutional and structural racism. At the same time, post-slavery, we've seen, the lack of fulfillment of a promise to free slaves to give them land. And now, as you're deeply involved with, the land that they do have is being stripped and stolen, and it's being ripped apart from
Mm-hmm.
African American farming families.
Mm-hmm.
So land sovereignty, food sovereignty, human rights are all
all of
more
a piece
important now than ever.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they're all of a piece. Yeah, they are all connected. So what I'm hearing is that the more people that see this film in whatever way, whether it's a DVD or a online event, or eventually when we get back to being able to gather to see gather. I mean, and so this film could have a life of a few years here to get people up on what's happening around the Indians, native Indian countries' reclaim of their foods and their foodways.
That it's a great time to be discussing these issues. I think all of us can ask ourselves, number one, find out about the simple thing about whose land we're on, who are the stewards of the land that we might have a home on, we might work on. But number two, it's not enough to just say, like, I live on Lenape land in Queens, New York City. You might live on coastal Miwok, Pomo land,
Where I live,
where you are. But it's giving those native communities who still exist access back to that land in some way, shape, or form, letting them reconnect with the land that provided their people with food and cultural and spiritual importance for tens of thousands of years. It's the understanding, as for those of us who obviously aren't native, of what we can do to deserve the land that we occupy.
Right.
What it means to be a steward of this land, not just for our families and maybe the generations that we'll see come out of our lineage, but for the 7, 10, 15 generations in the future.
Yeah.
Reframing that idea of survival and the fact that, we've been on stolen land for now a couple hundred years. I mean, it's about time we started getting our act together.
Well said. So, Sanjay, I'm curious, you're a creative guy. You got lots of things going on in your mind. What's next for you after you launch this and shepherd it for a while?
Well, I'm really right now just focused on this.
Mm-hmm.
It's making a movie is a long process, and there are some filmmakers, and everybody is different, but there are some filmmakers who just want to make a movie and move on. I unfortunately or fortunately really enjoy the impact that a film can make, and I want to make sure that communities that can generate impact with this movie do so. I think we're really lucky that we're doing some virtual screenings with the James Beard Foundation. We're going to be doing screening with Slow Food chapter heads, and we're going to be part of Terra Madre in October.
Good.
Virtually,
Good.
Food Tank, Edible Magazine, and we're hoping that this movie really inspires a lot of deeply, deeply hyper local conversations.
Great. Well, I think we'll try and do something with Root to Change too through our network. That would be fun. Besides
awesome.
just this podcast. But so we're going to wrap up now. But I want you to give people one last description of how they can access the film.
Well, the film is going to be available on iTunes and Amazon, or maybe it will be by the time that the pod's out. It'll be available from September 8th onwards. People who are part of organizations or institutions can go to www.gather.film, F-I-L-M, and you can fill out a simple form on requesting a screening, and we'll provide support and instructions. We're always on social media at Gather Film on Instagram.
Great. Well, Sanjay Rawal, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for making another film and for being not just a filmmaker, but a true activist who's trying to transform our culture and our world. So thank you very much for your work and your time.
Well, I'm grateful that, we've got the inspiration and leadership and good work of folks like you. So Michael, it's been an honor to reconnect, and thank you very much for the time.
Yep. Take care. Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.